3 years ago, he launched a war on Ukraine. Now he's under pressure to stop it. Today, Vladimir Putin did not directly reject a 30-day ceasefire proposal, but raised multiple issues as to how it could be implemented.
We agree with the proposals for the ceasefire, but our position is based on the assumption that the ceasefire would lead to a long-term peace, something that would remove the initial reasons for the crisis. So the idea in itself is correct and we support it, but there are questions that need to be discussed, and I think we need to discuss this with our American partners. Maybe we need to have a call with President Trump and discuss this.
He spoke as US negotiators arrived in Moscow to formally put the ceasefire deal to the Russian government. They travelled on the instruction of President Trump, who believes he can convince President Putin to agree.
Well, we'd like to see a ceasefire from Russia. A lot of the details of a final agreement have actually been discussed. Now we're going to see whether or not Russia's there, and if they're not, it'll be a very disappointing moment for the world.
Ukraine says it wants the ceasefire, but it is clear they question if it will bring peace, as they dug more trenches close to the front line. Russia's position remains too unclear to say if their work will be wasted or not.
We have all just heard very predictable and highly manipulative words from Russia in response to the idea of a ceasefire on the front. Putin is essentially preparing to reject it at this moment. Of course, Putin is afraid to tell President Trump directly that he wants to continue this war, that he wants to kill Ukrainians.
Meanwhile, Ukraine's military have now been forced out of the one part of Russia they'd managed to occupy. After 7 months, large parts of Kursk are now liberated and back under Russian control. The Ukrainians had hoped to hold this land as a bargaining chip in any peace negotiations, but look set to lose it completely within days. The Russian leader in full military fatigues arrived in Kursk over the last 24 hours to reaffirm that Russian land is now in Russian control. When the Ukrainians seized it in August, it was the first time since the Second World War that Russian territory had been occupied by a foreign military. The Russian onslaught on Ukraine continues even as others talk of the possibility of peace. There is no sign of it here, and no great optimism either.
And Emma joins us from Kyiv tonight. Good evening to you, Emma. I mean, President Putin is posing a lot of questions about this ceasefire proposal. Is he playing President Trump? And if he is, how does Trump react and what pressure can he bring to bear?
Well, Russia has a long-held military doctrine of deception and obfuscation when it comes to situations like this, and I think we're starting to see that in play all over again, and that's something that President Trump will be very aware of. I think what's interesting about what was said today is almost what wasn't said. He neither said yes, nor no, nor even maybe. He just lavished President Trump with praise, which is always a good thing, and went on to ask so many questions. It was impossible to work out exactly what he did think about it, apart from that he was pretty much rendering the unconditional ceasefire completely invalid by the number of conditions he was putting upon it. And obviously some of the main issues that he's raised this evening are those that he's raised before, not least about Ukraine's sovereignty and what it tells us about how Russia sees the future of this country. He, of course, doesn't want it to join NATO. He wants limits on its military. He wants it to give up territory. And they are all things that are being echoed again in the comments that he's made tonight. And I think that's something that will cause great alarm for Ukraine and its allies. In terms of President Trump and what he can do, well, I think he will try and bring maximum pressure to bear if he can on the Russian leader. They are heavily sanctioned in Russia, but potentially he'll try and increase that. Or alternatively, if he doesn't get anywhere with that, he might try and arm Ukraine more heavily to try and force President Putin's hand. What I would say is that I think that in the coming days there will be a phone call between Trump and Putin where we would expect to see President Trump try and put additional pressure onto the Russian leader.